The hillside had always made a peculiar sound in the wind, and Thomas Aldrich had noticed it long before anyone spoke of the drought that would come. It was not a sound most men would remark upon. A low hum, almost a breath, that rose from a crack in the limestone shelf near the northern boundary of the 7 acres he had bought at the county auction for the price of a decent hat. Thomas noticed it on the first morning he walked the land alone, the deed still smelling of the clerk's ink in his coat pocket. He stopped where the grass thinned to gravel and cocked his head, the way his grandfather used to do when listening for a broken axle from 3 fields away. The hum came again. He knelt and pressed his palm flat against the stone, and the stone was cool, though the sun had been up 2 hours and everything else on the ridge had already begun to bake. He said nothing of it to anyone. That was his way. For 3 mornings running he returned to the same crack in the rock, always before the household woke, always with the same unhurried patience that neighbors mistook for slowness, and that his late wife had once called, not unkindly, the patience of a man who trusted the ground more than people. He brought a tin cup the second morning and held it near the crevice, and though he felt no wind against his face anywhere else on the hillside, the air issuing from that seam stirred the surface of an imaginary stillness he alone seemed to sense. On the 3rd morning he brought a candle stub and cupped it near the opening, and the flame bent, ever so slightly, toward the rock, not away from it, as fire bends from a draught, but toward it, as if something within was drawing breath. He did not know yet what this meant. He only knew that it meant something, and that his grandfather would have known what. The town of Millrock had laughed when Thomas bought the parcel. It was widely regarded as the poorest ground for 40 miles, a shelf of broken limestone and cedar scrub too steep to plow and too dry, by all accounts, to graze more than a handful of goats. Old Higgins Pratt, who ran the feed store and considered himself an authority on land in the way certain men consider themselves authorities on anything they have never had to work, had said within Thomas's hearing that a man would need to be simple to pay good money for a hillside that couldn't grow a decent weed. $7 had been the final bid. Thomas had raised his hand at 6, and when the auctioneer looked for a second bidder and found none, he had raised it again at 7 merely to be certain, and the gavel had come down to a ripple of quiet laughter among the men gathered near the courthouse steps. His Aunt Ruth, who had kept house for him since his wife's passing 2 winters past, had not laughed. She had gone still in the way women go still when they are afraid but do not wish to frighten the ones they love, and she had asked him, that evening over cornbread and buttermilk, what in the Lord's name he meant to do with 7 acres of rock. Graze it, he had said. Graze what? Grasshoppers? He had not answered, because he did not yet have an answer, only the sound of the hillside breathing and a suspicion he was not prepared to speak aloud. It was Ruth who reminded him, some weeks later, of the trunk in the loft of the old cabin, his grandfather Ezra's trunk, untouched since the burial, containing a wool coat gone to moths, a razor strop, and a notebook bound in cracked leather that no one in the family had thought worth opening. Ezra Aldrich had been a well driller and a water finder in his time, a man who had walked half the county with a forked willow branch and a reputation, depending on who told the story, either for uncanny skill or for outright foolishness. He had died when Thomas was 11, and Thomas remembered him mostly as a quiet presence who smelled of pipe tobacco and wet stone, and who had once let the boy hold the willow fork and feel it twist, unbidden, in his small hands above a spot that later yielded a well 40 feet down. Thomas climbed to the loft on a Sunday afternoon and opened the trunk himself. The notebook was thinner than he remembered, its pages foxed and brittle, the handwriting cramped and slanted with the particular economy of a man who had learned his letters late in life and never wasted one. Thomas sat on the floorboards with his back against a roof beam and read until the light failed. Much of it was unremarkable, accounts of wells drilled, prices paid, disputes over property lines. But scattered through the pages, in no particular order, were notes that Thomas read 3 and 4 times over, his lips moving slightly as he did when he needed to fix a thing firmly in his mind. Limestone country holds water in seams, not pools, his grandfather had written. Look for the crack before you look for the spring. A seam that breathes cool air in July is a seam with water moving somewhere behind it, for still air holds no chill. Sound is the second sign. Water moving through stone makes a hum you feel in your teeth before you hear it in your ears. Further on, Cedar and sumac will grow anywhere. Sycamore will not. A sycamore on dry ground is a lie the tree is telling you, and trees do not lie without reason. Follow the reason down. And on a page near the back, underlined twice. A found spring is not a finished spring. A seam must be opened slow, an inch a day in hard rock, or the water finds a new path around your work and you are left with a hole and nothing in it. Patience opens more springs than any drill. Thomas closed the notebook and sat a long while in the dark loft. And when he came down the ladder, his Aunt Ruth said later that he had the look of a man who had been given an instruction he did not yet know how to follow. He began the following week, and he began, as his grandfather's notes insisted he must, not with a shovel, but with observation. He walked the 7 acres end to end, marking on a scrap of paper every crack, every seep, every place the grass held a shade greener than its neighbors despite 6 weeks without meaningful rain. He found, 40 yards from the humming crevice, a lone sycamore no taller than a man, stunted and struggling, but undeniably a sycamore, growing from a fissure in rock where nothing ought to grow at all. He stood before it for a long while with his hat in his hand, the way another man might stand before a church door. The dog complicated matters, as dogs will. Thomas kept an old blue-tick hound named Scout, inherited along with the cabin and its debts from his late wife's family. A dog of settled habits who showed no interest whatsoever in chasing rabbits or barking at wagons, but who had, since the day Thomas first walked the hillside, developed an inexplicable fixation on the humming crevice. Scout would trot to the crack, sniff it at length, and then sit before it and whine. Not the whine of hunger or want, but a low, worried sound Thomas had heard the dog make only twice before, both times in the presence of illness. The mule, too, a stubborn gray gelding named Pardon, refused outright to drink from the stock tank Thomas filled from the town well, and would instead wander to a shallow puddle collecting near the base of the rock shelf after even the lightest dew, drinking from it with an eagerness that seemed, to Thomas's eye, almost desperate. That mule's got better sense than half the men in Mill Rock, Thomas told Ruth one evening, and she had not laughed, because by then the town well had begun to drop, and no one in Mill Rock was laughing about water anymore. The dry spell that summer was not, at first, spoken of as a drought. It was spoken of as a slow spring and a late rain, and then, as June gave way to a rainless July, it was spoken of less and less, the way men grow quiet about a thing they fear naming. The county paper noted 11 days without measurable precipitation, then 19, then 31. The Mill Rock town well, which served 8 households and watered stock for a dozen more, dropped from 11 feet of standing water to 6, then to 3. Higgins Pratt began rationing feed. The Baptist church held a prayer meeting for rain that filled every pew and yielded, in the weeks that followed, not a single cloud. Thomas began digging on the 4th of July, a date he remembered afterward only because Ruth remarked upon the irony of a man celebrating independence by breaking his back on a hillside everyone had told him was worthless. He did not use dynamite, though a neighbor offered to lend him a case of it cheap. His grandfather's notebook was explicit on this point, underlined with a violence that suggested hard-won experience. Blast a seam in limestone, and you may shatter the very channel that carries the water, scattering it into 100 cracks that lead nowhere, where a slow hand would have opened one true path. Thomas worked instead with a pick, a hand drill, and patience, widening the humming crevice by inches, hauling the broken stone away in a wheelbarrow with a wheel that wanted grease. He kept a ledger. It had been his grandfather's habit, and it became his own, a plain composition book in which he recorded, each evening by lamplight, the day's progress in a hand that grew steadier with practice. July 4th. Opened crevice 8 inches, stone dry, no seepage. July 7th. 14 inches total, stone cool to touch at depth, faint dampness on drill bit. July 11th. 22 inches, drill bit came up wet for the first time, water smell present, no flow yet. The first true attempt came on the 16th day, when Thomas, encouraged by the wet drill bit, and against the explicit caution of the notebook, widened the last foot of the seam in a single afternoon rather than the slow inches his grandfather prescribed. Water came, a trickle no wider than a pencil, filling a coffee can in 11 minutes, and Thomas allowed himself, for perhaps the only time that summer, a moment of unguarded joy, calling for Ruth to come and see. But by the second morning the trickle had slowed to a drip, and by the third it had stopped altogether, and Thomas stood before the dry stone with the coffee can in his hand, and a feeling in his chest he did not have a word for, though later he would recognize it as the particular grief of a man watching a good thing slip away through his own impatience. He sat that night with the notebook open on his knee and read the underlined passage again. A seam must be opened slow, an inch a day in hard rock, or the water finds a new path around your work. I hurried it, he said aloud, to no one, and Scout, lying near the hearth, lifted his head at the sound of his master's voice and did not lie back down. Thomas began again the following morning, and this time he kept to his grandfather's measure exactly. No more than an inch of stone removed in a day, the work slow enough that Ruth worried aloud he would still be chipping at that rock come Christmas. He packed the widened seam each evening with clay he hauled up from the creek bottom, a trick the notebook called cribbing the water's patience, sealing the false channels so that whatever moved behind the stone would be coaxed, rather than forced, toward the single opening he was making for it. On the 9th day of the second attempt, an inch at a time, the drill bit came up wet and stayed wet. On the 11th day, a seep began that did not stop overnight. On the 14th day, Thomas knelt at the base of the widened crevice at dawn and watched water, clear, cold, unhurried, begin to gather in the basin he had chiseled beneath it. And this time he did not call for Ruth. He simply knelt there a long while with his hat off, and when Scout came and pressed his head against the man's knee, whining that same worried whine, Thomas understood for the first time that the dog had not been troubled by the crevice at all, but had been listening to it, the way the old man used to listen, and had been trying all along to tell him something true. The spring, once opened, gave a modest 4 gallons an hour. Not a river, not a miracle, but a small, steady mercy that Thomas learned to measure with the same coffee can, marking the level each morning in his ledger beside the old records of stone and depth. July 30th, for gallons per hour, holding steady. August 3rd, steady. August 9th, steady, despite 11 days now without rain. While Millrock's well dropped further, to 2 feet, then to 18 inches of standing water rationed by the bucket, the 7 acres everyone had mocked began, slowly, to hold green where the rest of the county had gone the color of a worn saddle. It was Silas Whitfield, a lanky boy of 16 who worked odd hours for whatever family in the district could spare a meal for his labor, who became Thomas's quiet ally that summer, arriving one morning unbidden with a coil of rope and an offer to help haul stone, and simply staying on. Silas did not ask many questions and did not offer much conversation, but he learned the rhythm of the work quickly, and it was Silas who suggested, without fanfare, that they build a cistern below the spring to catch the overflow rather than let 4 gallons an hour run to waste down the hillside, a suggestion Thomas turned over in his mind for exactly one evening before agreeing was sound. They built it from stone and mortar over the better part of 2 weeks, a squat cistern no larger than a small room, cribbed and lined the way Ezra's notebook described lining a well, and by the end of August it held some 600 gallons in steady reserve, filling by inches each day the way the seam itself had been opened. The squeeze on the rest of the district did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way such things do, in a slow tightening that could be measured, and Thomas measured it, because measuring things had become his habit that summer. The county paper reported the mill rock well down to 14 inches by the end of August. Feed prices at Pratt's store rose twice in a single month. 3 ranches to the east sold off stock they could no longer water, at prices so low that men who had scoffed at $7 for rocky ground now scoffed at nothing, having learned that summer what ground was actually worth. It was in the first week of September that Ellery Hollis came to the door. Hollis ran 200 head on a spread west of town and had been, in June, among the loudest of the men laughing on the courthouse steps. He came now on foot, having sold his second horse the week before, and he stood at Thomas's gate for a long moment before knocking, the posture of a proud man arriving at a door he had never expected to need. He asked, without much preamble, whether it was true what he'd heard, that the Aldrich boy had water on that rock pile, and whether he might, for a price or for labor, be permitted to haul 2 barrels a week for his kitchen and his milking cow. Thomas said nothing about the laughter of June. He simply said yes. and showed the man where to fill his barrels from the cistern spigot, and Ruth noted afterward, with some satisfaction she did not bother to hide, that Ellery Hollis had taken his hat off before he spoke and had not put it back on until he was well down the road. Mrs. Calloway came second, in the third week of September, a widow with a small dairy operation who had known Thomas's late wife, and who came not for herself, but for her 2 milk cows, standing in the yard with her hands twisted in her apron and an apology on her lips before Thomas had said a word. He filled her cans himself and would not hear of payment, though she left a dozen eggs on the porch rail regardless. The third to come was the Pruitt family, for children and a father whose own well had gone to mud, arriving in a wagon on a Sunday in early October with every water vessel the household owned rattling in the bed. Thomas measured out what the cistern could spare that week, marked it in his ledger. October 4th, Pruitt family, 40 gallons, cistern remaining 210, and stood with Silas at the gate watching the wagon rattle back down the road, the children's faces turned back toward the hillside, as though they were leaving a church rather than a farm. It was between the second visit and the third that Thomas came nearest to abandoning the whole endeavor, though he told almost no one so at the time. The trouble began when the flow from the seam, steady through August, dropped without warning in the last week of September to under 3 gallons an hour, and held there for 6 consecutive days despite everything Thomas tried, clearing the basin, repacking the clay seals, sitting before the crevice at dawn the way he had in the beginning, listening for the hum that had once seemed so certain and now seemed, to his tired ear, fainter than before. He began to suspect, in the low hours of those nights, that he had misread his grandfather's notes from the start, that the modest spring had been a fluke of a wet spring runoff rather than the true, deep seam Ezra had described, and that it was now failing the way the coffee can trickle had failed in July, only slower, only crueler, because this time whole families had come to depend upon it. He said as much to Silas one evening, sitting on an upturned bucket beside the cistern with the ledger closed on his knee for the first time in months. "I believe I've misjudged the thing," Thomas said. "I believe I ought to write to the Pruitts and the widow Calloway and tell them not to count on this come winter." Silas did not argue directly, which was not his way. He simply asked whether Thomas had checked the depth of the basin below the seam, or only the flow at the mouth of it. And when Thomas admitted he had not thought to measure the basin itself in some weeks, Silas fetched a length of cord with a stone tied to the end and lowered it into the collecting pool at the base of the crevice, marking the wet line with his thumbnail. "Water's backing up," Silas said. "Basin's silting in from the clay you packed the seams with. It ain't the spring going dry. It's the mouth going shallow." They cleared the silt the following morning, an hour's careful work with a hand trowel, and by that same evening the flow had returned to its steady 4 gallons, and held there through the whole of October without further trouble. Thomas wrote in the ledger that night, beside the 6 days of shortfall, not the water. The channel ought to have checked the simple thing before doubting the deep one. And beneath that, in a hand that pressed harder into the page than usual, "S. was right to make me look again." He did not throw away the letter he had begun to the Pruitts. He kept it folded in the back of the ledger for the rest of his life, a reminder, he told Ruth once in his old age, of how near a man could come to abandoning a true thing for want of patience to look one more time. The rains, when they finally came, arrived in late October in the ordinary, unremarkable way rains arrive after a long dry season. 3 days of steady gray weather that filled the mill rock well back to 8 feet and left the county roads a churn of red mud that every farmer in the district professed, for once, to be grateful for. But by then the worst of it had already passed for the families who had come to Thomas's gate, and the town's memory of that summer settled, as such memories do, not around the rain that finally fell, but around the $7 hillside that had not needed it. Higgins Pratt, to his credit, was among those who came in November, not for water, since by then the rains had eased the need, but to shake Thomas's hand at the feed store counter and admit, before 3 other customers, that he had been a fool in June and knew it. Thomas accepted the hand and bought his usual sack of meal and said very little, which was, by then, exactly what the town had come to expect of him and had, in its way, come to respect. The cistern held through the winter and into the following spring, replenished steadily by the 4 gallons an hour that never again wavered so long as Thomas lived to tend it, and Silas Whitfield stayed on as a hired hand in all but name. sleeping in the cabin's loft where Ezra's trunk still sat, its lid now kept oiled and its hinges kept from rust. Ruth planted a kitchen garden below the cistern's overflow that spring that yielded, by her own account, the finest tomatoes Millrock had ever seen, grown on ground everyone had once sworn could not grow a weed. Thomas kept the ledger going for years afterward, long past the point where anyone would have faulted him for setting it aside. Daily measures of the spring's flow, the cistern's level, the small steady facts of water moving through stone the way his grandfather had promised it would, if a man had the patience to let it. He added to it, in time, notes of his own in the same cramped economy Ezra had used, so that the book became a kind of conversation between two men separated by death and joined by rock. And when Thomas's own son was old enough to read, he was given the notebook and the ledger together and told, in the way such things are told only once and are expected to be remembered forever, that the two men who had found that water had not found it quickly, and had not found it by being clever, but had found it by being willing to wait an inch at a time for something the rest of the world had already decided wasn't there. It was Ruth who said, in the last spring of her long life, sitting on the cabin porch with the cistern's overflow trickling somewhere below the garden in the gathering dusk, that the whole business had taught her something she wished she had learned as a younger woman, that the worth of a thing was rarely visible on the day a man paid for it, and that some of the deepest waters in this world were the ones that took the longest and the gentlest hand to find. She said it to Thomas, who by then had gray at his temples and a boy of his own learning to read a well-worn ledger by lamplight, and Thomas only nodded, the way he had always nodded at true things that did not require an answer, and looked out toward the hillside where the sycamore, no longer stunted, had grown tall enough to shade the spring it had once been the only one to name.